In Montgomery County, officials have announced the arrest of a man in one of the most heinous crimes one could imagine.
Saturday was a nightmare for all of us.
Montgomery County
How could a tiny, defenseless child slip through the cracks of a system designed to protect her? How could her death go unnoticed for so long? This is not just the story of a life lost too soon. It's the story of a failure that went unnoticed until it was too late. A failure that didn't come from the outside world, but from within the very home that was supposed to nurture and safeguard her. When we think of tragedy, we often picture dramatic moments, loud sirens rushing to the hospital and frantic pleas for help. But in this case, the tragedy unfolded in the quietest way possible. It started with silence and it ended with silence. Zara Scruggs, a 10-month-old baby, lay lifeless in her father's apartment, and no one raised an alarm. Not at first. Not even when the signs were there. She had no voice. Her tiny body lay motionless, a victim of circumstances that no child should ever face. But what's even harder to comprehend is this. It wasn't just the child who was ignored. It was the very system that was supposed to protect her, the people who should have been her guardians, the community that should have been on alert. They were all silent too. This case isn't just about the end of a child's life. It's about how that life was neglected and ignored by the very people and systems that should have ensured her safety. It's about the way trust and familiarity can mask deeper issues until it's too late to save someone who couldn't even speak for herself. Zara was just days away from celebrating her first birthday when her life was tragically cut short. Her name, her smile, her laughter, gone in an instant. But the question that lingers is, how could this happen? How could no one notice, no one speak up, and no one protect her? To those of you who have been with us on this journey, thank you for your unwavering support. Your engagement, your comments, and your shares help us bring attention to stories that matter. To those new here, welcome. We're glad you're joining us. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe in justice and the power of raising awareness, consider subscribing. Your actions can help make sure these stories are heard, because when we stay informed, we stay vigilant. And when we speak up, we give a voice to those who no longer have one. Now, let's take a closer look at Zara's life, and the chilling truth behind the silence that surrounded her final moments. Zara Scruggs was born on December 1, 2019. Her name, unique and full of promise, reflected the bright future that was so cruelly taken from her. But to her family, she was Moo, a nickname that came from love, affection, and the gentle way she seemed to wrap everyone around her little finger. A name meant to capture the softness of her spirit, her smile, and the joy she brought to every room. Her short life was filled with milestones that parents dream of, her first steps, her first word, her first giggle, and her family soaked up every second of it. She was the light of their lives, the heartbeat of their home. Moo wasn't just a baby, she was a radiant force. Her eyes, wide and curious, always seemed to be taking in the world around her with wonder. And her smile, oh that smile, was something that could brighten even the cloudiest of days. Her infectious joy spread to everyone she met, and her presence was impossible to ignore. Zara had a way of making every person around her feel like they mattered. Even in her brief 10 months of life, she left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who had the privilege of knowing her. Her mother, Erica Scruggs, cherished her daughter more than words could express. Erica was the kind of mother who found magic in the smallest of moments. She kept a record of every milestone, every new word, every laugh that filled their home. Zara's love for music became a cherished memory that Erica would hold on to forever. As soon as the first notes of a song played, Zara would wiggle and move to the rhythm, her little body in sync with the beat. It wasn't just music, it was a part of her joy, her innocence, and her light. Erica adored her daughter in a way that only a mother could. To her, Zara wasn't just a child, she was a piece of her soul walking around outside of her. Every day with Zara was a gift, one that Erica didn't take for granted. She loved documenting their life together, from the first time Zara rolled over to the countless pictures of them smiling, playing, and laughing in the comfort of their home. Erica was present in every way for her daughter. It was clear that Zara was her world. She lived for the joy of motherhood, for the late-night cuddles and the first sleepy smiles in the morning. Every day was an opportunity to shower her daughter with love. But behind this perfect image, behind the smiles and the laughter, lay a family dynamic that, on the surface, seemed to work. Erica's relationship with her daughter's father, Austin Stevens, was complicated but amicable. They had gone their separate ways after their relationship had ended, but both had made an effort to co-parent and raise Zara together in a peaceful and respectful environment. The split was difficult for both of them, but the focus was always on what was best for their daughter. They had agreed on an informal arrangement where Zara would primarily live with Erica, but she would also spend weekends with her father. Austin had his own life, one that seemed steady and reliable to the outside world. At 29, he was well established, or at least appeared to be. He worked as a coach for the Lower Providence Warriors, a youth football team, and helped run a construction business, Black Diamond Construction. To everyone who knew him, he seemed like a man who had his life together. He dressed neatly, spoke well, and always seemed to be in control. His appearance didn't raise any red flags. He was seen as a good man, someone who could handle responsibilities. Despite their breakup, Austin remained an active part of Zara's life. The co-parenting agreement between Erica and Austin was informal, but they seemed to have found a workable routine that didn't involve the courts. There were no major conflicts between them, no big fights or disputes. When Austin came to pick up Zara, Erica's family didn't hesitate to hand her over. Her father, Zara's grandfather, would often greet Austin with a handshake or a smile, just as he had done before their separation. On the surface, everything seemed normal, almost routine. The handoffs between co-parents were uneventful, and everything appeared fine. There was a quiet trust in the arrangement. No one had any reason to believe that anything was wrong. It was a typical Saturday evening in early October 2020 when Zara's life would be changed forever. Austin arrived to pick up his daughter, and as always, Erica's family handed Zara over without hesitation. The child was calm as always, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Austin mentioned that he had just moved into a new apartment in Lower Providence. Some of the utilities were still being set up, but it wasn't something that seemed cause for concern. People move all the time. Temporary inconveniences like no heating or hot water weren't unusual, so no one pressed him further. Erica's father handed over his granddaughter with the same casual ease he had done so many times before. The trust between them, built over years, was unshaken. There were no warning signs, no sudden shifts in behavior from Austin, and no reason to suspect that anything would go wrong. Zara was simply going to spend another weekend with her father. A familiar routine. Nothing to worry about. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that routine was about to be shattered. The truth is, those silent moments of trust, moments like this handoff, are often the hardest to recognize as significant. When everything seems fine on the surface, it's easy to overlook the small signs that things are not as they appear. When the world feels familiar, it rarely triggers any alarms. This was one of those times. For Erica, handing over her daughter was just another part of the shared parenting arrangement. For Austin, this was just another weekend with his daughter. But in the quiet of his apartment, a storm was brewing, one that would tear apart a family, leave an entire community in shock, and rob Zara of the chance to live the life she deserved. It's easy to think that when everything feels normal, everything is fine. But the truth is, danger can often hide in plain sight, especially when we are lulled into a false sense of security. Zara's life before that weekend was full of love and joy. She was the center of her mother's world, a child full of laughter and curiosity. Erica had hopes for her daughter's future, hopes that were abruptly dashed. There were no warning signs that would have alerted anyone to the tragedy waiting to unfold. No public quarrels between Erica and Austin, no whispers of concern from family members or friends. Just an ordinary evening, just another exchange of custody. No one could have known how quickly everything would change. The heartbreak that followed could never have been anticipated, and it only makes the tragedy all the more painful. Zara's life, full of promise, laughter, and innocence, was taken from her in the most horrifying of ways. And the silence surrounding the events that led to her death would leave everyone questioning what could have been done to protect her. How could something so wrong go unnoticed for so long? How could the system that was meant to protect her fail so utterly? In the days that followed, as the investigation began to unfold, those closest to Zara would struggle to make sense of what had happened. The love that surrounded her, the joy she brought into the world, how could all of that be erased in an instant? The grief that followed was immeasurable. A family broken by the loss of a child, a community left reeling, and a broken system that failed to intervene in time. But even as the heartbreak took root, one thing became painfully clear. Zara's death was not a tragic accident. It was the result of neglect, of delayed action, of missed opportunities to protect a vulnerable child. And in the aftermath, the question that remained was not just how this could have happened, but how we can ensure it never happens again. Zara's story, her laughter, her light, her love, is now a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, the need for stronger protections, and the responsibility we all share in safeguarding the most vulnerable among us. The tragedy of her death is not just hers. It is a collective failure, one that we must all learn from. And in the memory of Zara, we find the motivation to fight for change, to advocate for children, and to make sure that no child's life is ever taken too soon without a fight. Her legacy, though brief, will echo in the hearts of those who loved her, and it will inspire us all to act before it's too late. Austin Stevens appeared to be the picture of stability. A 29-year-old man, he held a position in the community that many admired, a coach for the Lower Providence Warriors, a youth football team that shaped young athletes. He also helped run a local construction business, Black Diamond Construction, a company that seemed to promise both financial stability and a sense of responsibility. On the surface, Austin seemed to have it all together, a man who was reliable, professional, and respected by those who knew him. He dressed well, spoke confidently, and lived a life that looked well-ordered, even if you only caught a glimpse from the outside. To those who saw him interact with others, he seemed calm, collected, and capable of managing the demands of life. His image was that of a man who had found his footing. He wasn't just a father, he was the kind of man you could count on. The kind of man who might coach a game on Saturday and manage a construction project on Monday, with a smooth and confident balance between both. His calm demeanor didn't raise suspicions. If anything, it instilled a sense of security in others. But Austin's outward appearance, as stable and controlled as it seemed, masked a deeper, darker reality. Behind the well-groomed exterior, things were not as perfect as they appeared. His life had been marked by a separation from Zara's mother, Erica Scruggs. They had decided to part ways after their romantic relationship ended, but they agreed to co-parent their daughter in the best way they could, without involving the court system. Despite the breakup, the co-parenting arrangement was, at least on the surface, amicable. Erica and Austin had reached an informal understanding that Zara would live with her mother full-time, but on weekends she would spend time with her father. There was no tension, no bitter fights over custody, no contested court hearings. For those on the outside, it seemed like a healthy arrangement. There was mutual respect between Erica and Austin, and their ability to co-parent without involving lawyers or the courts painted an image of a modern family dynamic that worked. For Erica, the split was difficult, but she believed in the importance of Zara having a relationship with both of her parents. Austin had just moved into a new apartment in Lower Providence, a change that was viewed as normal. People move all the time, and temporary inconveniences like having no heat or working utilities were brushed off as minor hurdles. His new apartment, a space still being set up, was mentioned casually in conversation. It didn't raise alarms. Why would it? After all, Austin had always been someone who seemed in control. His outward appearance did not suggest anything was amiss. There was nothing that indicated his life was anything but on track, and certainly nothing that made others worry about Zara's safety when she stayed with him. For Erica and her family, this was just another routine handoff between co-parents. Zara's visit to her father's home was no different from the countless others before it. Erica trusted Austin with their daughter. She trusted that he would care for her, that he would provide the love and protection every child deserves. There was no reason to doubt him. He had never shown any behavior that would suggest he was anything other than a loving father. Even when he mentioned his apartment being a bit of a mess, it was seen as nothing more than a small inconvenience, certainly not something that should have raised concern. He had Zara's well-being at heart, right? Yet this was the beginning of the tragedy. Erica handed over Zara to Austin that evening, just as she had done many times before. The handoff was uneventful. No warning signs. No sense of unease. No feeling that anything was out of the ordinary. The day was typical, and Erica sent her daughter off to her father's home with the same trust she had always placed in him. But as the hours passed, the story of what was happening behind closed doors began to unfold. What Erica couldn't know in that moment was that the man who seemed so capable, so in control, was about to betray her, and betray the very child he was supposed to protect. Austin Stevens had been trusted. Trusted by Erica, trusted by his community, and trusted by his family. And in return, he had shown nothing but calm composure, an image of a father who was there for his daughter. But trust, when unexamined, becomes an easy thing to manipulate. Trust doesn't always mean safety. And for Zara, the trust that had been placed in her father would prove to be her undoing. Austin's interactions with others painted a picture of a man who appeared to be solid, a man who had it all figured out. People saw him as an upstanding member of society, a coach, a businessman, a father who made his daughter a priority. And even though Erica had no reason to question the arrangement they had made, that silence, that trust, would eventually be what made her blind to the cracks that existed beneath the surface. Austin's public persona and private actions didn't match. The contrast between how he was perceived and how he acted that night would be one of the key elements that shattered the illusion of his stability. Zara's death was not a sudden tragedy that came out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a series of missed signs, overlooked inconsistencies, and ultimately, a cold, calculated decision that would have life-altering consequences. The calm, composed image he projected to others was not the reality. In those critical moments on the evening of October 3, 2020, as Zara spent time in his care, Austin Stevens did not act as a father who was concerned for his daughter's well-being. His behavior, especially in the hours leading up to the emergency call, was unnervingly detached. Rather than acting swiftly when Zara's life was at risk, he engaged in casual online chats with women and searched medical terms like, "What to do if a baby stops breathing?" His reactions, or lack thereof, were startlingly inconsistent with the urgency of the situation. Austin's behavior on that night was in stark contrast to the man everyone thought they knew. In a time when a father's instinct should have been to protect, to act, and to save his child, Austin Stevens seemed more focused on managing his personal life than attending to the immediate danger his daughter was in. There was no urgency to get help, no sign of panic. Instead, his actions appeared rehearsed, methodical, even cold. The emotional numbness Austin displayed was especially troubling when compared to the normal reactions one would expect from a parent in such a dire situation. A parent who was concerned for their child would have made the call to 911 immediately, not waited, and certainly not continued to carry on with life as usual. But Austin did just that. He was online, messaging other women, and pretending like everything was normal, his daughter's life hanging in the balance, and yet he seemed to think it was just another day. What made this all the more disturbing was the discovery of Austin's digital footprint. His online searches, questions that every parent should know the answer to in a crisis, showed a man who was aware of his daughter's distress and yet didn't take immediate action. Instead of calling for help or seeking assistance, he spent precious time searching online for information that should have been common knowledge. The discrepancy between his actions and the urgency of the situation was impossible to ignore. Austin Stevens, the man who appeared so in control, the man who everyone trusted, was a far cry from the father he presented himself to be. And it was in those dark moments, when Zara's life was hanging by a thread, that his true character began to emerge. It wasn't the responsible, caring father that Erica and the community had come to know. It was something far more sinister, a man who, instead of acting to save his daughter, chose silence. Silence that would ultimately cost Zara her life. Zara's tragic end wasn't just about the failure of one person to protect her. It was the failure of everyone who trusted Austin Stevens. It was a failure of the system that didn't question his actions, a failure of a community that never thought to look beneath the surface. Austin was the last person anyone would have suspected, and yet his actions, his inaction, are what led to the horrific loss of Zara. This is where the story takes a darker turn. What everyone thought was a stable, trustworthy father would soon be exposed as someone who had become detached from the responsibility he had toward his own child. In the days that followed, Austin Stevens would face questions he was never prepared to answer. And the community that had trusted him would be left to reckon with the stark truth of what had happened. It wasn't just a loss of innocence. It was the loss of a life that should have been protected, but wasn't. The day of October 3, 2020, began like any other for Zara Scruggs and her mother, Erica. The morning was filled with the usual routine, getting Zara dressed, preparing breakfast, and enjoying the little moments that made up their life together. It was a Saturday, which meant that once the day came to a close, Zara would be heading off to her father's house, just as she did most weekends. There was nothing particularly special about the day. No reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. Everything seemed calm. Everything seemed right. Zara was 10 months old, a bright, energetic little girl who loved the simplest of things. A good song, her mother's comforting voice, and the warmth of her home. Erica had no reason to think this Saturday would be any different from all the others. She had an amicable co-parenting arrangement with Austin, Zara's father. While they were no longer together, they had agreed to keep their relationship civil, particularly when it came to their daughter. There were no fights, no custody battles, just a shared understanding that Zara needed both parents. And weekends with her father were part of that balance. As always, the handoff was seamless. Erica packed Zara's little bag with all the things she would need for the weekend. Extra diapers, a blanket, and a couple of her favorite toys. At around 3 p.m., Austin arrived at Erica's home, dressed in his usual attire, neat, composed, and ready for his time with Zara. They exchanged a few words as Erica handed over their daughter, and there was nothing about the encounter that raised any suspicion. It was just another weekend exchange, a normal part of Zara's life. But this time, as Erica's father handed Zara over to Austin, there was something Austin casually mentioned that seemed harmless enough. "The apartment still needs some work," he said. "There's no heat yet, no hot water, and the place is still being set up. But everything will be fine." He shrugged it off with a chuckle, as if to downplay the minor inconvenience. People move all the time, after all, and temporary hiccups like these were nothing to worry about. It was a small detail easily overlooked. At that moment, it didn't raise any red flags. For Erica, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. Austin had always been the type to downplay any difficulties, to keep things light and easygoing. She trusted him. There was no history of abuse or strange behavior. They had been able to co-parent without issue for the most part. Besides, Zara was always safe with her father. Why would she think otherwise? The fact that the apartment was a work in progress didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. Many people moved into new places and had to deal with a few minor inconveniences. Erica's father didn't hesitate either. He handed Zara over with a simple, "Take care of her, Austin," and the exchange was complete. As Erica watched them drive off, there was a sense of quiet reassurance. Nothing about the day felt unusual, and there was nothing to suggest that anything might go wrong. It was just another Saturday. But as the hours passed and as Austin made his way back to his new apartment, a far darker reality was unfolding, one that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. When Austin arrived at his apartment with Zara, there was still no sign of anything amiss. The apartment was small and bare, its darkness a reflection of the fact that it hadn't yet been fully furnished or set up. There was no heat, no working water, and the apartment looked more like a temporary space than a permanent home. But for Austin, this was just part of the process. Moving in was always a bit messy. He had said as much when he'd mentioned it to Erica earlier. He wasn't overly concerned about it, and there was no reason anyone else should be either. Zara, on the other hand, was completely oblivious to the state of her father's new living situation. She was just a little girl, happy to be in her father's presence, not aware that the environment around her was about to become anything but safe. Austin laid her down on the mattress he had set up on the floor of the living room, and she lay there quietly, playing with the few toys she had brought with her. She was content, innocent, and unaware of the threat that was looming. Austin spent some time in the apartment with Zara, but his behavior began to shift in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. What seemed like a normal evening quickly began to unravel as he shifted between moments of calmness and strange detachment. Instead of tending to his daughter or even making sure the apartment was in some semblance of order, Austin began to turn to his phone. His social media activity took over as he engaged in casual conversations, even flirting with women he was chatting with. There were no calls for help. No frantic messages to anyone. No sign that anything could be wrong. His focus remained on the small interactions on his phone, maintaining the appearance of someone who was simply passing the time. But behind the screen, Zara's situation was becoming increasingly dire. She was still on the mattress, now looking tired, quiet, and distant, something that no one in the apartment seemed to notice at first. It wasn't until later that the urgency of the situation started to settle in. But even then, Austin's response was chillingly slow. Between 9:27 and 10:22 p.m., he continued to search for medical information on his phone, looking up terms like, "What if baby stops breathing?" and "How to know if a baby is dead." Instead of calling for help immediately, he took his time, scrolling through information as if in a haze of confusion or denial. At no point did he reach out to anyone for assistance, and at no point did he seem to realize the gravity of what was happening. Zara's condition deteriorated further. She became less responsive, and the small signs of distress were now undeniable. Her breathing became labored. Her eyes grew dull. She wasn't crying, she wasn't moving. The silence was deafening, yet Austin remained detached. The urgency that would have been expected from a father in such a situation simply didn't come. Instead, he continued his online conversations, oblivious to the reality unfolding in his own apartment. At some point, the realization hit him. But by then it was already too late. Austin finally called 911 at 10:40 p.m. His voice, calm and eerily controlled, described a different version of events. He claimed that Zara had slipped and hit her head while she was in the bathtub. He said that he had stepped out of the room briefly, and when he returned, she was unresponsive. But when paramedics arrived, they found a completely different scene. The bathtub was dry. There were no signs that Zara had even been in it recently. There was no water running, and the story didn't align with what was happening in the apartment. Paramedics found Zara lying motionless on a mattress, her small body cold and lifeless. Austin, standing off to the side, watched them work with a disturbing detachment. He didn't rush to help. He didn't seem frantic. His demeanor was strangely calm, almost too calm. When paramedics asked questions, he answered in a matter-of-fact tone, as though he was merely watching a procedure unfold. It was clear that something was deeply wrong. The contrast between Austin's behavior and the life-or-death situation before him couldn't have been starker. His composure was chilling, and the lack of panic or urgency was immediately noticeable to the emergency responders. Yet even as they fought to save Zara, Austin remained still, emotionless. His failure to act, to intervene, or to show any sign of distress set the tone for what would become a devastating investigation. As the paramedics worked tirelessly to save Zara's life, time continued to slip away. But the window of opportunity was closing. The delay in his response, the strange behavior on his phone, and the oddness of the scene were all building into something far worse than anyone could have predicted. The emergency call wasn't just a moment of panic for a father who couldn't cope. It was a critical moment that could have been prevented. Zara had been lying in that apartment for an entire hour before anyone called for help. By the time the emergency services arrived, it was already too late. The narrative that Austin had given them began to unravel. His story of a tragic accident didn't hold up under scrutiny. And as the investigation into his actions started to unfold, it would become clear that his behavior during the critical moments before the emergency call was no accident at all. This was no ordinary tragedy. It was something far darker, and the clues were all there. Hidden beneath layers of normalcy, beneath the casual interactions and the calmness that Austin projected. The truth was unfolding in real time, and with each passing minute, the terrifying reality of what had happened in that apartment became more apparent. The evening that began with what seemed like an ordinary visit between father and daughter ended in unimaginable heartbreak. The routine of a handoff between co-parents turned into a nightmare, and the trust placed in Austin Stevens would be shattered forever. Zara's life was slipping away as her father acted as though everything was normal, detached, distracted, and unwilling to take the necessary steps to save his daughter. In the tragic moments that followed, the reality of what had been done, or rather what had been left undone, would soon come to light. As the hours ticked by that fateful evening, the situation in Austin Stevens' apartment became more dire. What began as a seemingly normal evening with his daughter, Zara, slowly morphed into something far more sinister. The events that unfolded over the next hour would be the turning point in this tragedy, an hour that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. What should have been an emergency call for help became an agonizing delay, marked by disturbing detachment and a complete failure to act when it mattered most. It was 9:27 p.m. when Austin first looked down at his phone, his fingers beginning to scroll through a list of search results that would later shock investigators. Zara was lying motionless on the mattress in his apartment, her small body quiet and still. She had been unresponsive for some time, but Austin had yet to call for help. Instead, he searched online for terms like, what to do if a baby stops breathing, and how do you know if a baby's heart has stopped? In that crucial hour between 9:27 and 10:22 p.m., Austin's priority was not his daughter. It was his phone. His search history revealed a man more concerned with gathering information on medical emergencies than on taking immediate action to save the life of his own child. Every moment was precious. Every second could have meant the difference between life and death. But instead of acting, Austin turned to his device as if it were just another task to manage. The clock ticked on, and while Zara's breathing grew more labored, and her tiny body grew colder, Austin was consumed with gathering information on the very emergency that was unfolding in front of him. During that time, Zara's condition continued to worsen. Her small chest barely rose and fell. Her skin grew colder. Yet, despite the clear signs that something was terribly wrong, Austin made no move to call for help. He didn't rush to the phone. He didn't make frantic calls to family members, to doctors, or to anyone who could help. Instead, he continued to flip through his phone, absently scrolling, as if reading about emergencies could somehow fix the one happening right in front of him. At 9:50 p.m., the situation was becoming undeniably dire. Zara wasn't just resting. She was unresponsive. Her body had gone completely still, and her face appeared drained of color. Yet Austin remained eerily calm. His daughter, the little girl he had once been so proud of, was slipping away in front of him, but Austin Stevens continued to act as if it was just another day. While Zara's life hung in the balance, Austin was messaging other women on social media. He sent images of himself, commented on casual conversations, and continued with his normal routine. All the while, Zara's condition became more critical by the minute. There was no mention of his daughter. No urgency in his words. No sign that he was even aware of the situation unfolding in his apartment. The contrast between the crisis at hand and Austin's nonchalance was jarring, even to those who would later investigate the case. One can only imagine the state of mind that could allow a father to scroll through his phone and engage in meaningless chatter, ignoring the life-or-death reality happening just feet away. His behavior, in hindsight, seemed almost as if he had already given up on Zara. Perhaps in his mind, the outcome was already sealed, and the delay in calling for help was simply a reflection of the cold indifference he had already allowed to take root in his heart. By 10:22 p.m., the search results Austin had clicked through began to take on an increasingly troubling tone. He had already searched for basic medical terms related to emergencies with infants. But at this point, it was clear that he had no immediate intention to intervene. There was no sign of panic. No attempt to take action. No emergency measures taken. Austin's behavior became even more chilling when investigators later revealed that during this critical window, Austin had been active in online conversations, exchanging flirtatious messages as though nothing was wrong. The messages were not of concern for his daughter, nor were they filled with any sign of distress. They were casual, light-hearted conversations, completely disconnected from the situation unfolding in the apartment. The fact that Austin Stevens could engage in these types of interactions while his daughter lay dying in the next room is a level of detachment that is difficult to comprehend. At 10:40 p.m., more than an hour after Zara had first become unresponsive, Austin finally made the decision to call 911. The dispatcher's voice on the other end of the phone must have been jarring, cutting through the fog of his detachment. In the recorded call, Austin's tone was disturbingly calm, even as he explained the situation. His daughter had slipped and hit her head in the bathtub. He explained that he had stepped out of the bathroom for a brief moment, only to return and find Zara unresponsive. There was no sense of urgency in his voice, no rush to convey the severity of the situation. It was as if he was explaining a minor inconvenience, not a tragedy that was unfolding before his very eyes. However, when emergency responders arrived on the scene, they were met with a completely different reality. The bathtub, which Austin claimed Zara had slipped in, was dry. There was no water running, no signs that Zara had even been in the bath. The room itself was cold, dimly lit, and barren, providing no comfort or warmth for the little girl who had been left to lie motionless on a mattress. Austin's story didn't match what the first responders found, and this disparity would set off a chain of events that would expose the true nature of his actions. What was most alarming to the paramedics was not just the scene in the apartment, but Austin's behavior. They reported that he was disturbingly calm, too calm for a father who had just discovered his child unresponsive. He didn't offer any information beyond what he had already told the dispatcher. He stood by, seemingly detached, as the emergency team worked on his daughter. He didn't rush to help, didn't cry out, and didn't seem to care as they desperately tried to revive Zara. His lack of emotional response stood in stark contrast to the urgency of the situation, leaving the responders baffled by his indifference. As the medical team performed their efforts, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Austin's story was unraveling, and the truth was beginning to emerge. Investigators would later confirm that the delay in the emergency call, combined with his strange online activity and passive demeanor, painted a horrifying picture of neglect. For over an hour, Austin had failed to act. His inaction was not just a failure to recognize the severity of his daughter's condition, it was a chilling refusal to intervene. In the critical moments leading up to the emergency call, the world around Austin Stevens seemed to slow. Zara's life, hanging by a thread, was fading, and yet Austin remained detached. His choices, his failure to act, defined the outcome. By the time the emergency services arrived, it was too late. The investigation would later reveal that Zara's death was not a tragic accident. It was the result of neglect, of delayed action, and of a cold detachment that sealed her fate. The critical moment, the window of time when a simple phone call could have changed everything, passed without a second thought from Austin. As the paramedics worked tirelessly to try and revive his daughter, Austin's failure to act became even more disturbing. His online searches, his flirtations, his indifference, these were not the actions of a concerned father. They were the actions of a man who had already chosen silence over responsibility, who had chosen inaction when his daughter needed him most. In the end, the emotional turn came not just in the moment when Austin made the call for help, but in the hours that he wasted before doing so. The delay in action, the absence of urgency, would haunt everyone who came to know the truth of what happened that night. It wasn't just the tragedy of a child's life being cut short, It was the tragedy of a father who couldn't, or wouldn't, do anything to save her. The moment Austin Stevens made the call to 911, a sense of urgency should have filled the air. But instead, his calm, collected voice echoed through the phone, almost too detached for the gravity of the situation. At 10:40 p.m., more than an hour after his 10-month-old daughter, Zara, had become unresponsive, Austin finally dialed for help. The voice on the other end of the line was sharp with concern, but his response, so eerily neutral, was anything but. "I need help," he said, his voice even. "My daughter fell and hit her head in the bathtub. I left the room for a minute, and when I came back, she wasn't breathing." The dispatcher immediately asked him to describe the situation more clearly, to provide more details on what had happened and the condition of his daughter. But his responses, despite the severity of the situation, remained strangely controlled. There was no panic in his voice, no frantic pleading for help, just a calm, almost rehearsed description of events. Zara, his daughter, who had once been a joyful, smiling child, was now lying motionless in a cold, dimly lit room. But Austin's voice betrayed none of the desperation that should have accompanied such a dire emergency. No father in a moment like this would remain so calm. And yet Austin did. As the dispatcher calmly asked for more information and instructed him on how to proceed until emergency responders arrived, Austin's responses remained flat. He provided details about Zara's fall, but his explanation did not match what was waiting for paramedics when they arrived at the apartment. The response from the emergency team was swift. They were trained to act under pressure, and within minutes they were on their way to the apartment. The situation was dire, but even as they raced toward the scene, something in the back of their minds must have been questioning the story Austin had told. The inconsistencies would soon begin to unravel, and the truth would begin to emerge. When paramedics arrived at Austin's apartment, the scene was not at all what they had expected. The story Austin had told them about Zara's fall in the bathtub made little sense. The first thing they noticed was that the bathtub was completely dry. There was no sign of water, no splashes on the floor, no wet clothing. In fact, the entire bathroom was eerily still, as if the scene Austin had described had never happened. The paramedics then turned their attention to Zara. She was found lying motionless on a mattress in the living room, a far cry from the scenario Austin had painted in his call. There were no obvious signs of injury from a fall in the bath, and the room she was in had none of the typical trappings of a child's space. The apartment was cold, dim, and sparse. Nothing about the environment seemed to provide comfort or warmth to the small child who had been left in such a vulnerable state. There was no warmth from a parent rushing to help, no signs of a father desperately trying to comfort his child. Instead, there was only an unsettling calmness from Austin, a quietness that chilled the paramedics to their core. The discrepancies between Austin's account of what happened and the scene that greeted the emergency responders were striking. The more they looked around, the more they realized that his story didn't match what they were seeing. Zara had supposedly slipped in the bath, yet there was no evidence of any water in the tub, no visible injuries from the alleged fall, and no signs that a bath had even taken place. The story didn't add up. But perhaps even more alarming than the lack of evidence was Austin's demeanor. As paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Zara, Austin stood to the side, seemingly detached. His neutral, almost indifferent, behavior was out of place in such a critical moment. A father watching his child's life slip away would be expected to be in a state of frantic panic, urging the medical team to save his child. Yet Austin simply watched. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer help. He didn't show any signs of being emotionally affected by the gravity of the situation. Paramedics later reported that Austin seemed almost out of touch with reality. While they fought to save Zara, he stood motionless, staring at them, offering no words of encouragement, no words of desperation, just silence. He didn't even attempt to get closer to his daughter as the medical team did everything they could to revive her. He was a distant observer, strangely uninvolved in the efforts to save his own child. His behavior was so out of place that it immediately raised suspicion among the emergency responders. Parents typically beg for help, plead for their child's life, and hover over their child's side. But not Austin. He stood back. His calmness in the face of such a life-or-death situation was a chilling contrast to the severity of the moment. The silence between the paramedics and Austin grew more noticeable as the minutes passed. No father should have been so absent, so distant when his child's life was on the line. His lack of concern was as unsettling as the emptiness of the room. The paramedics worked quickly, but the entire scene felt wrong. They could feel it. There was something about the situation that didn't add up, and they weren't the only ones who noticed. In the emergency room, doctors continued their attempts to revive Zara, but despite their best efforts, it was too late. Zara's condition was far worse than anyone could have anticipated. The injuries they found were consistent with blunt force trauma, and the damage to her small body was catastrophic. No amount of medical intervention could undo the damage that had already been done. Zara had passed away. As the hospital staff processed the heartbreaking news, the investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death began. Law enforcement soon arrived to question Austin, and it didn't take long for the inconsistencies to become glaringly apparent. Austin's calm, neutral demeanor continued throughout the questioning. He stuck to the story about the bathtub accident, but his behavior raised more questions than answers. The more authorities probed, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to shift. There were gaps in his timeline, discrepancies in his description of events, and no explanation for why he had waited so long to call 911. The investigation turned quickly, and it was soon clear that Austin's story didn't hold up. His strange detachment, his delayed response, and his complete lack of urgency raised serious concerns about his involvement in Zara's death. Authorities began to examine his digital footprint, looking into his phone activity during the critical time leading up to the emergency call. What they found sent shockwaves through the investigation. Austin's online activity during the window between 9:27 p.m. and 10:22 p.m. was particularly damning. Instead of calling for help, he had spent over an hour searching for medical advice about how to handle an infant who had stopped breathing. His searches included terms like, what to do if baby stops breathing, and how to know if baby's heart has stopped. But instead of taking action, he continued to engage in casual conversations with other women, sending images of himself and chatting, completely ignoring his daughter's condition. The investigation had uncovered the full extent of his inaction. Austin had known his daughter was in distress. He had searched for help, but he had failed to act in time. His detachment, both during the emergency and in the moments leading up to it, painted a picture of a father who had been more concerned with himself than with saving his child. His failure to take action, his refusal to intervene when his daughter needed him most, ultimately led to Zara's tragic death. The unraveling of Austin Stevens' story was swift, and as the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that his actions, or rather his inactions, were at the heart of the tragedy. His failure to act, his strange calmness during the rescue efforts, and the inconsistencies in his account all pointed to a chilling reality. Zara's death had been preventable. But it was his indifference, his delay, and his detachment that sealed her fate. Austin's story would continue to unfold in the coming days, but the key moment, the moment when he finally made the emergency call, marked the beginning of the end. The discrepancies between his version of events and the reality of the scene spoke volumes. Zara's death was not just the result of a tragic accident. It was the result of a father who failed to protect his child when she needed him most. The investigation into the death of 10-month-old Zara Scruggs began almost immediately after her passing, as law enforcement sought to piece together the chain of events that led to her tragic end. The details surrounding the emergency call, Austin Stevens' neutral demeanor, and the discrepancies between his version of events and what was discovered at the scene raised immediate red flags. But it was the forensic evidence that would ultimately begin to reveal the chilling truth about what happened in that apartment on the evening of October 3, 2020. When first responders arrived at Austin's apartment, they found Zara unresponsive on a bare mattress in a cold, dimly lit room. There were no signs of a bath, no wet clothes, and no water in the tub. Austin had claimed she slipped in the bathtub, but the scene didn't align with his story. Zara's body showed no visible injuries consistent with a fall from the bath, and the apartment itself was eerily devoid of warmth or comfort, making it clear that this was not the child's usual environment. The paramedics had noticed something unsettling about Austin's behavior too. His tone was disturbingly calm, and his lack of panic or emotional distress was a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. The first responders, having dealt with many emergencies involving children, instinctively felt that something was wrong, not just with Zara's condition but with the way her father was behaving. Despite their suspicions, the focus was initially on saving Zara's life. But as the case unfolded, the investigation would reveal that the inconsistencies in the story and the eerie calmness of the father were just the tip of the iceberg. Forensic analysis and digital evidence would soon expose a chilling pattern of neglect and detachment. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office, led by Dr. Frederick Hellman, was tasked with conducting a full autopsy on Zara's body to determine the cause of death. What they found was both tragic and telling. Zara's cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in severe brain injuries. The The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The severity of the trauma indicated that Zara had suffered an intentional blow, not the accidental fall that Austin had described in his 911 call. The injuries to her head were inconsistent with a slip in the bathtub, and the lack of visible signs of an accident further suggested foul play. There was no evidence of any other injuries that might have been caused by a fall, no bruises or contusions on her body. The trauma was concentrated to her head, making it clear that someone had inflicted a violent blow. But even more troubling than the blunt force trauma were the circumstances surrounding the timing of her injuries. The forensic team found evidence that Zara's injuries had occurred some time before her unresponsiveness had set in. It was clear that she had been injured earlier in the day, before the emergency call was made, raising further questions about the delay in seeking help. As the investigation into Zara's death progressed, one of the key pieces of evidence that came to light was Austin Stevens' digital footprint. Investigators obtained a search warrant for his phone, and the contents of his device would reveal a disturbing contrast between the urgency of the situation and Austin's behavior in the moments leading up to Zara's death. From 9:27 p.m. to 10:22 p.m., while Zara lay unresponsive in the apartment, Austin had been actively engaged in his phone. During this crucial time, he searched for terms like, "If baby stops breathing, what if you don't hear baby heartbeat?" And "How do you know if a baby is dead?" These searches alone revealed that Austin was aware of the severity of the situation. But instead of calling for help immediately, he had spent precious time browsing online, as if the life of his daughter could be resolved by reading about medical emergencies. Even more unsettling, while Zara's life hung in the balance, Austin was not only searching for medical information but also engaging in casual, flirtatious conversations with women on social media. Investigators found that he was actively messaging two different women during the time when Zara was slipping away. He sent pictures of himself, engaged in lighthearted exchanges, and showed no signs of the panic or urgency a father would typically exhibit in such a situation. Austin's online activity stood in stark contrast to the life-or-death moment unfolding in the next room. His focus was on social interactions and distractions while Zara's condition worsened. There was no message to family or friends, no frantic phone calls for help. Instead, his phone was a vessel for casual conversation, with no mention of his daughter's distress. This detachment became one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. The contrast between Austin's online activity and his failure to act was almost unfathomable. It wasn't just that he was distracted, it was that he chose to engage in things that were entirely disconnected from the reality of the situation. Zara needed immediate medical attention, but instead, her father spent the final moments of her life scrolling through his phone, engaging in meaningless chats. The lack of urgency, the complete disregard for the crisis at hand, was chilling. As the investigation continued, the discrepancies between Austin's account of the evening and the evidence began to mount. The timeline he provided didn't add up with the physical evidence found at the scene. His claim that Zara had slipped in the bathtub didn't explain the lack of water or the dry state of the bathroom. His story also failed to account for the blunt force trauma to her head, an injury that couldn't have come from a fall in the bath. When investigators pressed him on the timeline of events, Austin's responses became more evasive. He failed to provide clear answers about what had happened in the hours leading up to the emergency call. Instead, his story kept changing, and his explanations grew increasingly inconsistent. He claimed that he had stepped out of the bathroom for just a moment, but the physical evidence contradicted this. No one believed that a fall could cause such severe trauma without some sign of struggle or injury elsewhere on her body. More troubling still was Austin's failure to seek help in a timely manner. The delay in calling 911, coupled with his strange behavior, raised suspicions that something more sinister had occurred. Why had he waited so long to call for help? Why had he acted as if everything was under control when it clearly wasn't? The lack of urgency, the delay, and the contradictory statements painted a disturbing picture of a man who had already made decisions about his daughter's fate long before the emergency services arrived. With the physical evidence and digital traces now working in tandem, investigators began to connect the dots. Austin Stevens' actions, or lack thereof, painted a picture of a man who had been more concerned with his own distractions than with the well-being of his child. His online behavior during the critical window of time was not just careless, it was callous. His failure to act, combined with the physical evidence of blunt force trauma, left no room for doubt. The death of Zara Scruggs was no accident, it was a crime. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the image of a father who could be trusted, who seemed so composed and stable in public, began to crumble. The calmness he displayed in the face of his daughter's death was not the mark of a concerned parent. It was the mark of someone who knew more than he was letting on. The lack of panic, the delay in calling 911, and the incongruity between his story and the physical evidence were all telltale signs that Austin Stevens had played a far more active role in Zara's death than he had initially admitted. As the investigation reached its peak, the weight of the evidence against Austin Stevens became undeniable. Forensic findings, digital traces, and witness accounts all pointed to one conclusion: Zara's death had been preventable. The injuries to her head were consistent with blunt force trauma, and her father's strange behavior in the hours leading up to the emergency call provided a chilling narrative of neglect and detachment. The investigation had uncovered something even darker than what had initially been suspected. It wasn't just the physical violence that ended Zara's life, it was the complete indifference shown by the man who should have been her protector. Austin Stevens had failed his daughter in the most profound way possible. His actions, both before and after the incident, had sealed her fate, and the investigation was now laying bare the truth behind the tragedy. The evidence was clear: Zara's death was not an accident. It was the result of a father who failed to act, who chose to ignore the cries for help, and who, in the end, was more interested in his own distractions than in the life of his child. The night that 10-month-old Zara Scruggs passed away in the apartment of her father, Austin Stevens, was the beginning of a harrowing journey toward justice that would unfold over the coming months. Despite the cold indifference and questionable behavior shown by Austin in the moments following his daughter's collapse, it was not until the investigation dug deeper into the inconsistencies of his actions that the truth started to emerge. The forensic evidence, digital trail, and eyewitness accounts ultimately paved the way for his arrest and the beginning of legal proceedings that would bring this case to the courtroom. After Zara's death, law enforcement swiftly moved to investigate the circumstances surrounding her passing. What began as a medical emergency quickly became a criminal investigation. Authorities began to question Austin's version of events, and the discrepancies in his story began to mount. His strange behavior, coupled with the evidence collected from the scene and his phone, raised suspicions that there was more to this tragedy than met the eye. The turning point came when investigators uncovered the disturbing online searches Austin had made during the critical hour when he should have been seeking help for his daughter. His searches for phrases like, "If baby stops breathing, what if you don't hear baby heartbeat?" and "How do you know if a baby is dead?" were troubling, but what was even more disturbing was the fact that he didn't make the emergency call until over an hour had passed. While Zara's life hung in the balance, Austin had engaged in online conversations and flirtations, completely disconnected from the seriousness of the situation. The inconsistencies in his story, the lack of urgency in his actions, and the forensic evidence, all pointed to a much darker reality. Austin Stevens was not the concerned father he had initially appeared to be. Instead, he was a man who had failed to act in his daughter's moment of need, whose actions revealed a disturbing detachment from the gravity of the situation. It wasn't long before law enforcement decided they had enough evidence to arrest Austin. On October 6, 2020, just days after Zara's death, Austin Stevens was arrested and charged with aggravated assault, child endangerment, and eventually first-degree murder. The charges were a direct result of the forensic findings, including blunt force trauma to Zara's head, and the overwhelming evidence that Austin had failed to seek timely help. The initial charges brought against Austin were based on the evidence that had been uncovered during the investigation. The forensic evidence, including the blunt force trauma to Zara's head, pointed to homicide rather than an accident. The digital traces revealed a man more concerned with his own distractions than the well-being of his daughter, and the delay in his emergency call raised further suspicion about his involvement in the crime. The first charges, aggravated assault and child endangerment, were followed by the more serious first-degree murder charge after further investigation. Prosecutors were now certain that Austin had intentionally harmed his daughter and had failed to intervene when he had the chance. The digital trail, combined with the physical evidence of Zara's injuries, provided the prosecution with a clear case. The severity of the charges sent shockwaves through the community. A man who had once been seen as a stable, responsible figure, coaching youth football and running a local business, was now facing the most serious charges imaginable. The public's perception of Austin, once so positive, began to crumble. The arrest of Austin Stevens sent ripples through the community that once supported him. To those who knew him, it was almost impossible to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man now facing such serious charges. Austin had been seen as someone who had it all together. He was a coach for the Lower Providence Warriors, a youth football team that many in the community admired. He was a businessman running Black Diamond Construction, and he had a reputation for being responsible and reliable. His calm demeanor and neatly put together exterior had led many to view him as a model citizen, someone who could be trusted with the care of his own daughter. But as the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Austin's true character was far removed from the public image he had carefully crafted. As details about his actions that night came to light, the community was shaken. How could someone so seemingly stable, so calm, and so involved in the community be capable of such horrific actions? The man who had been trusted by so many now seemed unrecognizable. For Erica Scruggs, Zara's mother, the shock of Austin's arrest was overwhelming. The pain of losing her daughter was unbearable, but now she had to grapple with the reality that the person she had once trusted to care for their child was the very person who had taken Zara's life. It was a gut-wrenching revelation, one that left her emotionally shattered. She had believed, like so many others, that their co-parenting arrangement was in the best interest of their daughter. Now she was forced to come to terms with the fact that Austin had been capable of such cruelty, that the father she once trusted had become the person responsible for Zara's death. The public outcry was intense. Friends, family, and even strangers who had followed the case reacted with outrage. There were cries for justice, not only for Zara but for every child who might be at risk. People began to ask questions. How could this happen? How could someone who seemed so trustworthy, so stable, betray the trust placed in him and harm an innocent child? It wasn't just a family torn apart. It was a community left grappling with the realization that a person they thought they knew was capable of something unspeakable. Once Austin Stevens was arrested, the legal proceedings began in earnest. The prosecution moved swiftly to build its case, and the evidence against Austin was overwhelming. The forensic findings, including the blunt force trauma to Zara's head, left no room for doubt about the cause of her death. The physical evidence from the crime scene, the digital activity on Austin's phone, and his delayed response to the emergency call all pointed to one conclusion. Zara's death was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act of violence. The prosecution's case was bolstered by the digital evidence, which showed a clear timeline of Austin's actions during the critical hours leading up to the emergency call. His failure to act, his failure to reach out for help, and his lack of urgency were all documented, leaving little room for Austin to claim that the situation had simply gotten out of control. His online activity, which included flirtatious conversations with women while his daughter's life hung in the balance, painted a disturbing picture of a man who was more interested in his own distractions than in the life of his child. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the prosecution pushed for the maximum possible sentence for Austin. First-degree murder charges were presented, and the legal team began preparing for trial. The evidence against him was strong and the case was clear. But despite the overwhelming evidence, Austin's defense team began to prepare for a counterattack. They argued that there had been no intent to harm Zara, that her injuries could have been the result of an accidental fall or an unexpected tragedy. The defense team attempted to paint Austin as someone who had made a mistake, someone who had failed in the heat of the moment but didn't intend to harm his daughter. However, this defense was quickly dismantled. The delay in calling 911, the lack of urgency, and the disturbing online activity made it clear that this was not an accidental injury. This was a crime, one that had been calculated and carried out in the most callous of ways. As the case continued through the legal system, the community's focus began to shift from Austin's actions to ensuring that justice would be served for Zara. The hashtag Justice for Zara gained traction online, with people from all walks of life coming together to raise awareness about the case and to demand accountability for the crime. Local organizations, child advocacy groups, and concerned citizens rallied around Zara's memory, determined to make sure that her death was not in vain. They organized vigils, fundraisers, and awareness campaigns aimed at strengthening child protection laws and ensuring that parents who failed to protect their children would be held accountable for their actions. The community's grief was deep, but so was their resolve to see that justice was done. The legal journey was far from over, but the wheels of justice were turning. With each passing day, the case against Austin Stevens grew stronger. And as the trial approached, the people who had once seen him as a model citizen were left grappling with the harsh reality of the man he had become. Austin's arrest had marked the first step toward justice for Zara. Now it was time for the courtroom to do its part. As the trial date drew closer, the question that had haunted the community from the beginning remained: how could a father, someone entrusted with the care of his child, betray that trust so utterly? The charges against Austin Stevens were not just a legal matter. They were a call to action for everyone who believed in the sanctity of a child's life. The people who had supported Austin as a coach, a businessman, and a father were left to reckon with the truth of his actions. Their confusion, their heartbreak, was shared by those who had never met him, people who simply couldn't understand how someone could harm the very person they were supposed to protect. The case had become about more than just the facts. It had become about ensuring that something like this never happened again. For Zara, for all children, and for justice. The tragic death of Zara Scruggs was not just the loss of one young life, it was a profound wake-up call. As the investigation unfolded and the chilling truth about her father's actions came to light, the case became much more than a personal tragedy. It became a glaring example of how easily signs of abuse can be overlooked, how trust can blind us to the dangers that may be hidden behind closed doors, and how systems that are meant to protect can fail those most vulnerable. Zara's story is heartbreaking, but it is not unique. Tragically, children all over the world are subjected to harm by the very people who should be protecting them, parents, guardians, and those in trusted positions. This case highlights how, despite the best intentions of family and community, abuse can go unnoticed until it's too late. How easily we can believe that everything is fine when in reality things are far from it. How much we, as a society, have to learn about the subtle signs of harm and the need for constant vigilance. Zara's death was not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger societal issue. Trust, while important, can sometimes be dangerous when placed blindly in the wrong hands. Austin Stevens presented himself as a loving father, a responsible man, someone who could be counted on. He played the part well. So well, in fact, that those around him, family, friends, even the community, never questioned his ability to care for his daughter. Zara's mother, Erica, trusted him. He was Zara's father, after all. They had an amicable co-parenting arrangement, and everything seemed fine on the surface. But trust, when unexamined, can be dangerous. We place trust in people every day, whether it's our family members, colleagues, or even strangers. But what happens when that trust is misplaced? What happens when someone we love, someone we trust implicitly, fails to protect what matters most? In this case, it was a father who should have protected his daughter but chose to remain detached. And it wasn't just a moment of negligence, it was a pattern of inaction, detachment, and ultimately harm. What makes this case even more unsettling is the way systems that are supposed to protect children failed Zara. There were warning signs, things that didn't add up. Austin's strange behavior, the delay in the emergency call, his lack of panic. These were all things that, had they been questioned sooner, might have made a difference. But no one asked. No one suspected. And in the end it was too late. Zara's story is a reminder that the systems in place to protect children need to be stronger. It's a reminder that we need to be more vigilant in noticing the small signs, the quiet red flags that, when ignored, lead to heartbreak. The social services, the community, the legal systems, they all have roles to play. But at the end of the day, it's the people in our lives, friends, family, teachers, neighbors, who are the first line of defense. We need to be willing to speak up when something feels wrong, when we see something that doesn't add up. We cannot afford to remain silent when we see signs of trouble. Zara's death might have been prevented if someone had spoken up earlier, if someone had questioned the strange behavior, if someone had noticed the signs and asked the hard questions. But instead we remained silent. We allowed trust to blind us to the possibility of harm. This is where we all come in. Each and every one of us has a responsibility to be vigilant. It is not enough to assume that everything is okay. It is not enough to wait for someone else to act. When we see something that doesn't feel right, we need to speak up. We need to trust our instincts. And we need to raise our voices, not just for Zara but for every child who might be at risk. The truth is, it is easy to overlook the signs of abuse. It is easy to assume that everything is fine, that we are wrong to worry, that there is no cause for concern. But we cannot afford to be complacent. Every day, children are suffering in silence, and we may be the only ones who can help. By speaking up, by intervening, by paying attention, we can make a difference. It might be uncomfortable. It might be difficult. But the price of silence is too high. This is where you come in. You can help prevent future tragedies like Zara's by speaking out and staying informed. You can help by recognizing the signs of abuse and taking action when you see something wrong. Share this video to spread awareness, and leave a comment below on how we can better protect children. Let us know what signs we should all be looking for, and how we can create a safer, more supportive environment for the children around us. Zara's story is heartbreaking, but it doesn't have to be a story that is forgotten. It can be the catalyst for change, the spark that ignites a movement to protect vulnerable children from harm. We have the power to make a difference. We have the responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If you've ever seen something that didn't feel right, if you've ever had a moment of doubt or concern about the safety of a child, speak up. Your voice might be the one that saves a life. Don't wait for someone else to act. Be the one who steps forward, who asks the tough questions, and who helps bring about change. When we stay vigilant, when we trust our instincts and pay attention to the small signs, we create a world where children can grow up safe. We prevent tragedies like Zara's from happening again. But to do that, we need to be proactive. We need to be aware of what's happening around us and take action when necessary. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable. But it is always necessary. Zara's death is a reminder of how easily abuse can go unnoticed. It's a reminder that trust, when misplaced, can be dangerous. But it's also a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. By staying informed, by speaking up, and by being vigilant, we can prevent another tragedy from occurring. The road to justice for Zara is still ongoing, but we must ensure that her death is not in vain. We must honor her memory by taking the lessons from this case and using them to protect children in the future. This is not just about one child. This is about making sure that no more children suffer in silence. It's about creating a world where every child is safe, every parent is held accountable, and every person is willing to speak out when something feels wrong. If you believe in the importance of protecting children, if you believe in the power of awareness and vigilance, then take action today. Share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to stay informed. We need to spread the message that silence and complacency are no longer options. We must remain vigilant, speak up when we see something wrong, and do everything in our power to protect the most vulnerable in our society. Zara's story isn't just her own. It belongs to all of us. It is a call to action. It is a reminder that when we see something that doesn't feel right, we cannot remain silent. We must speak up and we must act. Together we can make sure that no child suffers the same fate. Together we can make a difference. Zara's voice is no longer here, but ours can be. Let's make sure that her story becomes one of change, one of action, and one of justice. Zara Scruggs' life was tragically cut short, and while her death left an irreplaceable hole in the hearts of her family, her story should not be defined by the way it ended. Instead, it must be remembered for the lessons it imparts. The lessons about trust, vigilance, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable in our society. Zara's memory lives on, not just in the hearts of her loved ones, but in the wake of the tragedy that serves as a solemn reminder of the role we all play in safeguarding the lives of children. Her infectious smile, her wide eyes that lit up the room, and the love she brought to those around her should never be overshadowed by the circumstances of her death. Zara was a child who deserved a future filled with laughter, joy, and the embrace of those who loved her. Instead, she was taken too soon, not because of an accident or an unavoidable tragedy, but because of a failure to notice the signs, to take action when it was needed, and to ensure her safety in the hands of someone who should have protected her. While we mourn her loss, we must also honor her memory by carrying her story forward. It is through Zara's story that we are reminded of the importance of awareness, of the responsibility we each have to speak up when something doesn't feel right, and of the crucial need to protect children from harm. In her short life, Zara unknowingly touched many hearts, and in her death, she has sparked the conversation about child safety, about trust, and about the dire consequences of complacency. Zara's story is a stark reminder that harm can happen when we least expect it and when we let our guard down. It's easy to assume that the people we trust are always going to do the right thing, that everything is fine because it appears to be fine. But as this case shows, the dangers that lurk behind closed doors are often hidden until it is too late. When we overlook the subtle signs, when we believe that someone would never harm a child because they seem fine, we are failing in our duty to protect the most vulnerable among us. In Zara's case, it was the small, overlooked moments, the delay in calling for help, the detachment of a father who should have been frantic with concern, that added up to something far more dangerous than it seemed at first. It is a painful truth, but it is one we must face head-on. When we fail to notice the warning signs, when we ignore the gut feeling that something isn't right, we put children at risk. But it doesn't have to be this way. Zara's story is a call to action. It's a call for all of us to be more vigilant, to listen to our instincts, and to speak out when something doesn't feel right. We cannot afford to be passive observers when it comes to the safety of children. Every day there are opportunities to protect them, to ask the hard questions, to challenge the status quo, and to be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Zara's death did not just affect her family, it rippled out, touching the entire community. People who knew her father, people who saw him as a reliable, stable figure, now had to come to terms with the reality that their trust had been misplaced. The man they had once supported, the man they thought they knew, had been the one responsible for taking Zara's life. This is the hardest part. When someone we trust is capable of such harm, it shakes the very foundation of our sense of safety. But it's not enough to just feel shocked or heartbroken. We must use that emotional reaction to fuel our desire for change. It is easy to assume that such things will never happen in our own circles, in our own communities. But the truth is, abuse often hides in plain sight. It is easy to miss the warning signs or dismiss them as isolated incidents. But Zara's story is a reminder that no one is immune to this kind of tragedy. Whether we are parents, teachers, family members, or friends, we all play a role in creating a safe environment for children. And when we fail to act, when we fail to speak up, we allow harm to continue. The community surrounding Zara's family now carries the responsibility of honoring her memory and ensuring that her death was not in vain. The lesson of her life and death is that we cannot afford to be passive observers when it comes to child safety. Each of us has a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and that starts with being aware, being vigilant, and speaking up when necessary. Zara may no longer be here physically, but her spirit continues to live on through the awareness her story has brought to the public. Her life, while brief, has sparked a much-needed conversation about the ways in which society often overlooks signs of abuse and neglect. She has become a symbol for every child whose voice has been silenced, every child who has suffered in silence, and every parent or guardian who feels powerless in the face of an imperfect system. Her memory should inspire us to be better, to be more aware, to act when it matters most. Zara's life is not defined by the circumstances of her death. It is defined by the love she gave to those around her, the joy she brought to her mother's life, and the reminder she leaves behind for us all to do better, to protect better, and to love better. As we reflect on Zara's life and the tragic events that followed, it is clear that this story holds deeper meaning than just the loss of a child. It is a call for us all to be more vigilant, to stand up when something doesn't feel right, and to ensure that no child suffers in silence. Zara's story is a reminder of the importance of trusting our instincts, of questioning what may seem ordinary, and of always putting the safety and well-being of children first. It is easy to overlook the small signs, the subtle shifts in behavior, or the moments that don't quite add up. But those moments matter. They matter because when we ignore them, we risk losing someone like Zara. So, as we honor her memory, let us also take action. Let us be the voices for the vulnerable, the protectors of those who cannot protect themselves. The loss of Zara was heartbreaking, but it is through our actions that we can ensure that her story leads to real change. Zara Scruggs is more than just a tragic statistic. She is a reminder that we have a collective responsibility to protect our children. We must not wait until it is too late. We must act now. We must be vigilant. And we must always remember that Zara, in her brief time with us, taught us one of the most valuable lessons of all: the importance of safeguarding those we love, and the necessity of staying vigilant, no matter how comfortable we may feel. May Zara's memory live on in the steps we take to protect future generations. May her legacy inspire each of us to do better, to speak up, and to act with the urgency and compassion that every child deserves.